All right, we're talking with Pat O'Day today. We're at the event at Bellevue Hyatt Regency to honor Jimi Hendrix and you and your relationship with him and the statue that they're going to be sculpting that is going into Seattle.
Right.
So what's the idea behind that? Who came up with that idea?
I don't really know. It's kind of developed a life of its own. The statue is derived from a photograph. Jimmy's first visit to Seattle, we had him in the arena. And Jimmy had called me a couple of weeks before he came to town and said, "Pat, can you get me an assembly at Garfield High? You know, they kicked me out of there, and I'd like to go there and be in assembly and play music." So I called Frank Fiddler, who was a friend of mine, who was the principal of Garfield at the time, and said, "Frank, do you know the story of Jimi Hendrix?" He says, "I've heard something," because Jimmy, you know, was kind of out there on the fringe right at that point, and certainly was not a black artist, or a black appeal artist.
Right.
So he said, "Well, okay," but he said, "Let me get back to you." He called me back and he said, "We have used all of our allocation for assemblies. However," he said, "on that day, we do have a pep assembly because we're playing Franklin that night. What if we cut the pep part of the assembly short and then Jimmy could play a couple of songs?" Great. So I told Jimmy, and Jimmy was very excited. Now, as it turned out, the day of the assembly, the equipment guy couldn't figure out where he'd parked the truck the night before after the concert. There was a party, and they didn't know where the truck was. What to do? Noel and Mitch were just as happy to stay in bed anyway. So Jimmy and I headed up for Garfield, and what we did is I told Jimmy on the way, I said, "Jimmy, what we'll do, I will introduce you, I'll give you a great introduction, and then let's have the students ask you questions about the music business, how you achieved this great fame, and that way you can interact with them and so on, and make your return to Garfield significant." Jimmy was not feeling well himself that morning, number one. But number two, he was absolutely frozen when he entered that school. Here's a guy that can get before thousands of people, right, and play and sing, and he walked into his old high school and he is struck with fear. Anyway, so Frank Fiddler introduced me. I got up and talked about Jimmy, how he had left, been in the service and then went to England, and his great career, how it was exploding and so on. And so I said, "Let's welcome Jimi Hendrix." At that point, Jimmy came out of the wing. I turned and shook Jimmy's hand as he came to the microphone.
Yep.
And that is the photograph that was taken of that by the Seattle Times.
Wow.
Is the foundation for the statue as I'm shaking Jimmy's hand.
Wow.
Now the rest of the story is, Jimmy went to the microphone paralyzed with fear, and he said, "Well, I'm glad to see you're still doing the purple and white thing. Purple and white, fight, fight." And at that point he stepped back and said nothing. I sense that he's just absolutely paralyzed with fear. So I stepped forward to the microphone and I said, "Jimmy is here, and he's delighted to share his experiences and how he has achieved at this level of fame with you. And so if you have any questions, please come forward, use the mic so everybody can hear your question." There was a long pause. Finally, sensing that the thing was stiffing, a cheerleader came up got on the microphone, and she's, Mr. Hendrix, how do you write a song? Jimmy leaned to the microphone and he said, I've got to go catch an airplane. And he said, I'm going to leave now. And he says, as I go out the back door and get into the limousine, I remember the assembly will end and the bell will ring. And when I hear that bell ring, it will help me write a song. Thank you, it was nice to be here. And he split out the door.
Oh my gosh.
But anyway, that's the story of Jimmy's visit to Garfield. Here was an African American that had graduated from Garfield, that had established huge fame, came back to Garfield, and the African American students had no clue who he was. My contact with Jimmy, this is kind of interesting. Jimmy and I, we were now handling all of his appearances, and we're sitting in Houston one night in the dressing room, and Jimmy said, Pat, do you remember when we first met? And I said, you mean at the Attorney's in New York? He said, nope, it was before that. I said, when? Okay, now I got to go back. 1961, Spanish Castle is the big teenage dance. The groups would blow their amps in those days because the amps were small, inadequate, and they would plug two guitars into the same amp, right? The kid came up to me and he said, now when they would blow their amps, sometimes that was it for the night, you know. The kid came up to me and he said, I always have my amp in the car, and he said, it's a big Gibson, and he said, if you blow all the amps, he said, you can always use mine if I can stand on the back of the stage and play. Don't worry, I know every lick they do. It's like, fine. About 2 or 3 weeks later, Tiny Tony and the Statics were playing out there. They blew their amps. The kid comes up and says, you want my amps? I said, yeah, get them. So he brought his amps in and he stood on the back of the stage and played. I forget that. Sitting in the dressing room, Jimmy says, where we first met, I said, the Attorney's. He said, no, remember at the kid at the Spanish Castle that loaned you his amps when the amps blew out? And I went, oh my God.
That was you.
It's you. Jimmy did go to work for us for Concerts West, and we handled all of his appearances because he knew me from old Seattle days. And he said, well, it's a Seattle guy, I can trust him, you know.
Right.
So that's kind of the story behind the story.
Okay.
But Jimmy was wonderful, so talented, everybody knows that. Humble, friendly, kind, generous, unselfish, impeccably honest. Jimi Hendrix was a 10 on the scale of 10 when it comes to human beings.
Wow. Do you think that there's been enough to honor him in Seattle? And how do you think that this statue will contribute to that?
Anything we can do to keep his memory alive is important, because what he did with his instrument will endure. And I think that the Experience Music Project and statues, or whatever it may be, will continue to link his brilliance and the impression and the impact he made, and Jimi Hendrix, the individual, keep the two together forever.